Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. For more than 2 years, the Trump administration has exerted what it calls maximum pressure on the Islamic Republic of Iran, crippling its economy in general and its income-producing oil industry in particular. While Tehran is yet to give in to this pressure, the American measures have exerted a toll on the Ayatollah regime, which in turn brought about a militant response and a threat of a wider escalation. To analyze the current situation, we're joined here in the studio by Dr. Emily Landau, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies. Welcome.
Hi.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Mr. Meir Javedanfar, who is an Iran lecturer at IDC Herzliya. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader update on the latest developments pertaining to the Islamic Republic and the U.S.
Jonathan, we are probably going to touch upon several forces and personalities in both Tehran and Washington. But the ultimate decision makers are the Ayatollah Khamenei and President Trump. Eventually, after the entire mechanism in either capital has finished its staff work, we are waiting to hear and see what Khamenei and Trump are saying and doing. And it seems that after the tension of late April and early May, when a collision looked imminent, they are trying to tone down their rhetoric and they are trying to find some channels of communications. And you can hear Secretary of State Pompeo, for instance, in visiting Switzerland, which is the protecting power for the United States in Tehran, has been for the last 40 years, suggesting that the Iranians and the Americans can talk, should talk, and obviously Khamenei, while not saying make love, not war, does come out against war and against negotiations, but obviously one can have some sort of a mediation through some interlocutor without calling it negotiation.
Dr. Landau, when we're looking at the situation, we hear mixed messages, both from Washington and from Tehran, for that matter, as well as the regional partners of the United States in the region and the regional partners of the Islamic Republic in the region. Instead of voicing rhetoric with regard to an imminent escalation between the Islamic Republic and the United States, now we hear the proxies voicing their more resilient stance that if the United States would attack Iran, they will respond and the entire region will configure to a wider escalation, while we hear also the opposing forces of Iran calling on the international community to unite and stand firm in front of the malign activity that is evident in different sectors, including the oil sector, which was harmed during the late April and beginning May. To what degree is that now going to shift to more of a proxy war rather than a frontal collision course, which was so imminent, as Mr. Owen stated earlier?
I don't think it's really going to move to any kind of proxy war. I think these are the kind of statements that we've heard many times before about how the region will go up in flames if, this or that does this or that. I actually don't think that war was as imminent as some would have liked to have made it. We heard the voices, especially of Democrats in the United States, saying, this is what the Trump administration has wanted all along. They're marching towards war and really fanning the flames of war that I don't think was in the interest either of the United States or of Iran. There was always this chance of perhaps miscalculation that could lead to misescalation, but I never had the sense that war was imminent, really. And I think what we're seeing, I agree with what was said, we're seeing now that it's a good sign. We're sort of getting past the tensions and the more aggressive rhetoric. And it seems that things are moving more in the direction of a possible negotiation. I think the last statement by Rouhani, he didn't even say that the U.S. needed to lift sanctions first. All he said is that the negotiation has to be done from a point of respect to Iran. So they're, watering down the preconditions. Pompeo has just said that the United States will negotiate with no preconditions. So the 12 points of Pompeo that everyone thought were preconditions for sitting down are more preconditions for the deal itself, but not for sitting down and starting negotiations. And we also, as was said, we're hearing more and more about possible mediators, whether the Swiss, who again represent the United States interest, or the Omanis, who also mediated back in the Obama years. And several other states have been mentioned as well. I think Japan maybe, and a few others. And so it looks like things are going to move in that direction, which was the purpose of the pressure campaign in the first place. That's what it's all about. Iran responds only to pressure. When it is pressured, then it finally comes to the conclusion that the best way to get that pressure lifted is probably by sitting down with the other side.
Mr. Javedanfar, I would like to get somewhat of an explanation to understand the Iranian structure of things. As Mr. Oren stated earlier, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. He has the final voice, and every decision that he makes is a decision that will be kept by Iran, for that matter. Nevertheless, when we hear Hassan Rouhani, the president of Iran, saying that we're willing to negotiate for that, watered down as it may, but still there are certain conditions that are set by Hassan Rouhani for bringing about negotiations with the United States, the Ayatollah immediately came out and also spoke and said that no, there are not going to be any negotiations with the United States. Of course, he also indicated once again that there's not going to be a war with the United States, but he is very adamant about not having any negotiations. Who do we listen to? The Iranian president, who states that there will be possible negotiations, or that the Iranians are willing to sit and negotiate, or the Ayatollah, who is quite clear about his sentiments with regard to talking with the Americans?
We have to listen to Ayatollah Khamenei. Rouhani said this morning that, yes, they are willing to talk, but America has to first lift the sanctions, has to go back. This morning he said it. It was on BBC Persian.
Yesterday he didn't.
He said that the United States has to return to the negotiation table and has to return to the deal that it left. But whatever Rouhani said, even if he would have said that he's willing to negotiate with the United States, it's Supreme Leader Khamenei. Recently, just to give a bit of context to your viewers in terms of balance of power, Rouhani said that during Obama's presidency, he was asked by the Obama administration on 19 different occasions to meet. And in none of the occasions he had the mandate even to answer the Obama administration. Ayatollah Khamenei has said that talking with America is poison. Okay, so I think that's the end of that for now. Why did he say it? Because he knows that Rouhani and others want to talk to the United States, because they are the ones facing the full brunt of the people of Iran. It's the government that is more answerable to the people of Iran, not the regime.
So is this somewhat of a maneuver by Ayatollah Khamenei, who in front of his followers in the weekly address and teaching that he gave, stated that, I've told already Hassan Rouhani and Mohammad Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, about the Americans. I've warned them during the negotiations that it's not going to yield any results, and that eventually they will backtrack on their executive decisions and so on, laying all the blame on the government of Hassan Rouhani, while taking a few steps backwards, and at the same time saying there's not going to be new negotiations. Is it trying to somewhat exclude the government and weaken them in the face of the eyes of many Iranians who might have more sympathy towards the government of Hassan Rouhani rather than the Ayatollahs and the Islamic regime?
I think it's two-sided. There are two audiences. One of them is the government, and one of them is the government who wants a more moderate line, and the other is the Americans. Look, the Iranians. It was only recently that Bolton sent. He said that there's a new U.S. carrier group going to Iran, and after that great show of force, Trump today sounds like Barack Hussein Obama. Remember when Obama recognized the Islamic Republic of Iran and its leadership? Trump just did that. And the Iranians are watching this. The Iranians are also watching all the impeachment against Trump. They're also watching the 12 conditions that Pompeo gave up. So the Iranian hardliners, it seems to me, are saying to the moderates also, let's wait. It's the other side who is weakening, even though if you're living in Tehran, you would disagree with that. But in the argument that we have to hold, and it's by holding that we will succeed, they're seeing the results. It was Trump who was before slamming the regime. Now he's saying that he said, I cannot believe these words. Iran can be a great country even under the current leadership. This is music to the ears of those who say that we have to stand steadfast because they've turned Trump already into Barack Obama and they want to see what else they can get from him.
Mr. Oren?
Well, first of all, Dr. Landau and myself disagree on the value of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action of 2015. But I think...
which is the nuclear agreement between world powers and Iran. Yeah.
But I think Dr. Landau will agree with me that it too was achieved due to pressure on the Iranian regime. But now Trump has tried to revoke it. He withdrew the Americans from the deal. The Iranians have sounded as if they may be willing to go halfway. The IAEA has just come out with a report saying that, yes, they have enlarged their stock of heavy water and they have restarted enriching uranium, but they are within the limits of the deal. So it looks as if both sides are trying to play to their home audiences by saying, yes, we are tough, we are not doing what the other side tries to push us to do, but they are now trying to indicate to the other side that the time may soon be ripe for negotiations.
Nevertheless, when we're looking at the situation, we see the Iranian regime sending still weapons to Syria, being implicated for the bombings in the United Arab Emirates of the four oil vessels, and at the same time also implicated for the Houthi rebels who actually vocally came out and said, we were responsible for bombing the pipeline that transfers oil from the Arabian Gulf towards the West.
That's all true, but this is outside the scope of the nuclear deal. Now, one may argue whether the ballistic missile program is on the margins of the deal or not. It is not part and parcel of the deal, but along with the deal, the United Nations have called on Iran to cease these activities. But the whole game is whether there is going to be a new improved deal which will include all of those subjects which are not part of the deal. But for the time being, the other countries and the organizations, that is the EU and the IAEA, who are either parties to the deal or executing it, verifying it, monitoring it, are saying that Iran is in compliance.
Well, the question, though, however, with regard...
It's not as rosy as you
not?
just presented it, no, because there's a question about the IR6 centrifuges. Iran has already installed 33 of these centrifuges. They were not supposed to install more than 30, and that was only in year 8 to 10. Now we're in year 3 of the deal, and they have already installed 33, and some of them they have already operated.
So they're in violation?
There's a question here because, you know, one of the problems with the nuclear deal is that the language is not always very precise because they tried to fudge things so that the sides would agree. So it's not clear that there's a violation here, but it's certainly not in the spirit of what was the provisions in the deal to already in year 3 have 33 IR6s installed. And this is a question that could go to
But this is not the reason
the deal.
Trump withdrew from the
No,
deal.
but I'm just saying, and we also have to remember the IAEA has never said Iran is in compliance. It doesn't use that language. It says that it is within the limits that have been defined by the deal. No, because that's very important. The word compliance is never used by the Amano.
And what I would like actually to touch base on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is a nuclear agreement with Iran, which was ratified by UN Security Council 2231, which basically provided legal grounds for this deal. Nevertheless, it was never signed by either sides of the party, and the UN resolution, as vague as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was when it called upon the parties to act, so was the UN Security Council resolution, which called on all parties to uphold to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action rather than terminology that actually demands actions to rectify the situation. With regard to the compliance of Iran, if you will. And this is a question to both you, Emily, and Meir. When we're looking at the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iranians know that this deal is dead, basically. The moment
Not true.
the moment the Americans pulled away from this deal, what the Iranians were supposed to receive in return for compliance has been taken out of the equation. My question is, do the Iranians continued so-called compliance, because as you just explained, you can't really use the word compliance for the Iranian conduct within the framework of the agreement? Is that an action, however, of self-preservation, or is it an action of trying to salvage something that clearly doesn't benefit them as they initially hoped for?
Look, the JCPOA is the best deal that the Iranians could have dreamed of. The Iranians were caught red-handed. They were working on a military nuclear program for years. They were deceiving, they were lying, they were cheating. They were telling lies to the IAEA, to the international community. And for all of that, they got this deal that only required minimal nuclear concessions for maximum sanctions relief. Now they're fighting to get their sanction relief back. But remember, a lot of the demands that they're demanding go beyond what they were promised in the JCPOA. Nobody promised them that the Europeans would go for, enormous energy deals and all these things that they have been demanding from the Obama years. The actual sanctions that needed to be lifted in the initial stage were all lifted. The Iranians wanted more. These were not things that were promised in the JCPOA itself. They were expectations that the Iranians had, that once they pocketed that, they were going to go for these bigger deals and that the Europeans would play along, and that's what they've been doing. But I want to say one word about the Americans and the Trump administration, because let me just...
We'll get back to it. So, Mr. Javedanfar, your response to this same question?
Can I just change the topic slightly, because we're talking about...
Not too much, because she wanted to change the topic as well. Please.
Look, the Iranians, the Iranians are why are they keeping the deal? Because they see it for now. It serves their best interest not to take on the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Americans, then the Chinese and the Russians also. But I think to hold out till the 2020 elections. But I think one thing the Iranians don't understand is that even if in 2020 a Democrat is elected, the missile issue is going to be back on the table. And Ayatollah Khamenei said something recently that wasn't picked up by the international press, which it should have been. He said negotiation over defense issues such as missile is discussing namus. Namus is like honor, but you have like your own honor. But namus is about somebody, for example, talking to your wife, insulting your wife or insulting your mother, which means that this is going to be completely off the negotiation table, the issue of missiles. So I think the Iranians, even if they keep the IA, let's just say Trump doesn't win, some of the sanctions are lifted, the Europeans will want to talk about missiles, and Iran made it easier for them to talk about missiles after they wrote on that ballistic missile that Israel should be wiped at the face of the earth. And Iran is going to face the prospect of sanctions. I think I disagree that Iran got the best deal that it had, even though Iran had cheated. We saw the recent documents that were brought by Israel from Tehran. I understand that from a European diplomat that the quality of the intelligence from them was excellent. But I still think that the supervision that we have in Iran is going to be the problem. The problem that Trump has exposed Israel to is the following. He withdrew from the deal unilaterally. That's the problem. He didn't have the Europeans and and we see how important the Europeans are to Iran because that's one of the reasons why they're staying in the deal. And I think, look, what Trump is doing is a very high-risk strategy. And we have to wait and see what happens in 2020 because it could be make or break for his Iran policy.
Let me just say something about the Trump administration because it's so often accused of being inconsistent, having messages coming this way and that way. If you look at the entire strategy, it's not really inconsistent. What is the Trump administration saying? They're saying we're putting in place a maximum pressure campaign because pressure is the only thing that we have seen that has any impact on decision making in Iran with regard to the nuclear issue. The goal of the pressure campaign is to get them back to negotiation. However, Trump has been accused of marching to war, of actually stoking regime change. And so some of these messages about being willing to deal with the current regime are to answer those in the domestic scene that are accusing him of going for regime change. So he's saying, we're going to talk to this regime, but nothing has been lifted in terms of the toughness with regard to what they are going to be demanding from the Iranians. If we see them walking back from their demands with regard to improving the deal, then I would agree with Meir that this is a problem. And the Trump administration, my concern with regard to the Trump administration is that they're not preparing themselves well enough for a negotiation. It's going to be a tough negotiation. It's going to be a bargain situation, and the Iranians are very good at this kind of bargaining.
Mr. Oren, I would like to bring Israel and Saudi Arabia into the picture. On Friday last week, there was the Quds Day, which is the annual commemoration of the Ayatollah regime, which has also a widespread support all over the Shiite Muslim world with regard to calls to recapture so-called Muslim lands, including Jerusalem. Al-Quds, by definition, means the holy site, Arab language reference to Jerusalem. To what degree do you think that Israel and Saudi Arabia are in immediate danger with regard to a possible escalation? Also considering the fact that Israel last week and at the beginning of this week have targeted Iranian infrastructure, at least according to various reports, of Iran and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards in the T4 airbase in Syria.
In the earlier part of this comment, you referred to Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon, who threatened that in case of war between the United States and Iran, Israel and Saudi Arabia are going to be hurt, presumably by proxies or allies of Iran, such as Hezbollah itself, firing at Israel from Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen firing, as they already have, at Riyadh and other places in Saudi Arabia. Now, what we see militarily between the United States and Iran is two paper tigers roaming either in the zoo or in the savannah, wherever it may be. The American paper tiger is much bigger, is much stronger, but nevertheless, it is a paper tiger. Why? Because it cannot protect its allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and smaller Gulf countries.
Unless it preemptively targets Iran.
Nevertheless, there is going to be enough trouble. But not only that, the American military right now is in transition. It is being transformed from fighting Daesh and earlier Al-Qaeda to trying to fight, if the need arises, Russia and China. It is not well suited to fighting Iran, and only a few days ago, the United States Air Force has announced that it has a shortage of 2,000 pilots for its combat missions, which means that the United States cannot sustain a military campaign for long. It doesn't want to put it to the test because its endurance is very limited. So everyone knows it. Of course, there are moves, the carriers and all of that, but all sides would like to step back from the brink.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing statement. Mr. Javedanfar, we'll start with
regarding
you. With regard to the topic, Iran, where are we heading to?
Look, I think for me it's much more going to be interesting the Majlis elections that are coming up in Iran. There seems to be a widespread attack against the reformists, and I think the internal disputes in Iran are becoming far sharper. And I think Ayatollah Khamenei is going to keep out, but he doesn't have the support of the people. It's so obvious that the regime is cut off, and we can see it from the fact that they don't allow anybody to discuss the prospect of talks with the Americans.
Dr. Landau?
From what I see in recent days is that things are moving in the direction of a possible negotiation. This was the hope and the expectation. As I said, the most important challenge now for the Trump administration is to prepare itself for that negotiation, because if it's just shooting from the hip, with Trump meeting with I don't know who on the Iranian side, that's not going to work. It needs to be very carefully prepared.
Mr. Oren?
Donald Trump is a non-professional politician. Some would say unprofessional, but he's definitely not a professional politician. But more than any of his predecessors, his foreign policy derives from his domestic policy. And as he is looking towards the 2020 elections, he is looking less and less back to his pledges regarding Iran and towards the future, what will help him in the elections, which means that he doesn't need a war on his hands.
Nevertheless, the European shift rightwards might shift their attitude towards Iran, which might also impact the situation.
But they don't want to get involved in a war either.
Well, we'll see what the French and British might say when all their interests in the region might be at stake. This is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Emily Landau, Mr. Amir Oren, and Mr. Meir Javedanfar for being here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.